They started laughing before he even reached the counter. It wasn't loud at first, just a few chuckles, a whisper behind a palm, a smirk exchanged between two men leaning against the glass display. But laughter has a way of growing when it finds easy prey. And that morning, under the harsh brightness of a clear daytime sky pouring through the gun shop windows, the target was a tired, worn-out single father who looked like he didn't belong there. His name was Arman Qureshi, and he hadn't slept properly in weeks. His clothes told a story before he even said a word. Faded jeans with a small tear at the knee, a simple shirt washed too many times, and worn-out shoes that had seen more miles than most people would walk in a year. His hair was slightly unkempt, his face lined with exhaustion, but his eyes carried something different. Something heavier, something that didn't belong to a man being laughed at. Behind him, clinging gently to his hand, was his 6-year-old daughter, Meher, her small fingers wrapped tightly around his as if letting go would mean losing the only safe place she had left in the world. And still, they laughed. Before we go further into this powerful story, take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel Home with Dad if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the strength of a parent who refuses to give up, because stories like this deserve to be heard. The bell above the shop door had barely stopped ringing when Arman stepped fully inside. The smell of polished wood, metal oil, and something sharp and sterile filled the air. It was a place of confidence, of authority, of men who knew exactly what they were doing, and Arman looked like he had walked in from a completely different world. He hesitated for a second, scanning the displays, unsure of where to begin. Meher looked around too, her eyes wide, curious but quiet. She had learned far too early in life how to stay small in unfamiliar places. Arman wasn't there for anything flashy. He wasn't there to impress anyone. He had spent the last 3 nights going over his decision again and again, losing sleep over whether this was right, whether he was doing the right thing as a father. Every step into that store felt heavier than the last, like he was carrying the weight of every choice he had ever made. The laughter grew louder. One man in a leather jacket leaned toward his friend, whispering something that made them both grin. Another customer shook his head, amused, clearly entertained by the sight of someone so out of place. To them, Arman was a joke, a man who looked like he could barely afford groceries, stepping into a place where people came to spend thousands without blinking. But they didn't know him. They didn't know about the nights he had spent sitting beside a hospital bed, holding Meher's tiny hand while machines beeped around them. They didn't know about the day his wife passed away, leaving him with a child and a silence that never quite went away. They didn't know about the job he had lost trying to balance work and fatherhood, or the endless rejections that followed when employers saw a man who needed flexibility they weren't willing to give. They didn't know about the break-in. That had happened just 2 weeks ago in broad daylight, while Arman had stepped out to buy groceries. He came home to find the door forced open, drawers pulled out, and the fragile sense of safety he had built for his daughter shattered in minutes. Nothing of great value was taken, but something far more important was stolen: peace. Since that day, Meher hadn't slept through the night. Every creak of the floor made her flinch. Every shadow in the hallway felt like a threat. And every time she asked with trembling lips if they were safe, Arman felt a piece of himself break. That was why he was here. Not because he wanted to be, because he felt he had no other choice. He approached the counter slowly, his grip on Meher tightening slightly as if drawing strength from her presence. The man behind the counter barely looked at him at first, too busy finishing a conversation with another customer. When he finally did glance up, his expression was neutral, but the atmosphere in the room had already shaped the moment. Arman cleared his throat softly, his voice steady but low as he began to speak, asking about something simple, something practical, something meant only for protection. The response he received was polite, but distant. The kind of politeness that says, "You're not really one of us." The questions came next, not harsh but edged with doubt. Subtle glances exchanged between staff. A slight pause before answering, a hesitation that spoke louder than words. And behind him, the laughter hadn't completely stopped. It had just quieted enough to become background noise. Meher looked up at her father, sensing the shift in the air. She didn't understand everything, but she understood enough. Children always do. She squeezed his hand a little tighter, her small voice barely audible as she leaned closer to him. Armand smiled down at her, but it was the kind of smile that hides more than it shows. He could have walked out, every instinct told him to. Pride whispered in his ear, urging him to leave before the humiliation grew deeper. But then he thought of Meher waking up at night, her voice shaking as she called for him, asking if someone was coming to hurt them again, and he stayed. He asked another question, then another, each one steadier than the last. Because when a parent chooses between pride and their child's safety, pride doesn't stand a chance. Minutes passed, but it felt longer. The atmosphere in the shop had shifted into something uncomfortable, like everyone was waiting for something to happen, though no one knew exactly what. And then the door opened again. The bell rang once more, sharp and clear, cutting through. The tension like a blade. The laughter stopped. Not faded, stopped. Footsteps followed, calm but commanding, carrying a presence that seemed to change the air itself. The kind of presence that doesn't need to announce itself, because everyone already knows. The owner had walked in. His name was Harris Walid, a man known in the community not just for running the most respected firearms shop in the area, but for something deeper, something harder to define. He carried himself with quiet authority, the kind earned over years, not demanded in a moment. He took in the scene with a single glance. The customers, the staff, the tension, and then his eyes landed on Armand. For a brief second there was silence, real silence, the kind that feels heavy, meaningful. Something unspoken passed through Harris's expression, something that no one else in the room understood. He stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. Every eye followed him as he approached the counter where Armand stood, still holding Meher's hand, still trying to keep his dignity intact under the weight of silent judgment. The man behind the counter straightened slightly, unsure of what was about to happen. The customers leaned in, curious now. Harris stopped just a few feet away from Armand. And then something unexpected happened, something that no one in that room would ever forget. He straightened his posture, his expression softening, not with pity, but with respect. Real respect, the kind that comes from recognition, not assumption. And then, in a voice clear enough for everyone to hear, he said the words that shattered every judgment in the room. He called him Sir, and said it was an honor. The silence that followed was no longer heavy, it was stunned. The laughter didn't just stop. It disappeared, like it had never existed in the first place. Because in that single moment, everything changed. The man they had mocked, dismissed, underestimated, was suddenly someone they didn't understand at all. And for the first time since he walked in, Armand looked up, not as someone trying to prove himself, but as someone who no longer needed to. What they didn't know yet was that this moment wasn't about a gun shop. It was about a past none of them had bothered to imagine. It was about sacrifice that didn't come with recognition. It was about a father who had once stood in places far more dangerous than this, making choices that saved lives while risking his own. And it was about to come to light. Harris's gaze lingered on Armand with quiet intensity, the kind that holds years of memory behind it. There was no rush in his movement, no hesitation in his voice. The room might have been full of people, but in that moment, it felt like only two men existed, one who had lived through something extraordinary and another who had never forgotten. Armand's expression shifted slightly, confusion flickering across his face. He wasn't expecting recognition. He hadn't come here to be seen. He had spent years learning how to disappear into the background, how to survive quietly, how to carry his past without letting it define his present. But Harris knew, not everything, but enough to understand that the man standing in front of him was not weak, not lost, not someone to be laughed at. He was someone who had already faced battles that most people would never survive, and the room began to realize it, bit by bit. The subtle change in posture, the way Harris addressed him, the absence of doubt in his tone. It all started to unravel the assumptions that had been made just minutes earlier. The same men who had laughed now avoided eye contact. The same staff who had hesitated now stood straighter, more attentive. Respect had entered the room, not loudly. But undeniably, Armand didn't say much. He didn't need to. His silence carried weight now, a quiet strength that had always been there but had gone unnoticed. Meher looked up at him again, this time with something new in her eyes, pride, and maybe just a little bit of understanding that her father was more than the world often saw. As the conversation continued, steady, respectful, different now, Armand found something he hadn't